Hi, my name is Kelp. Welcome to The Line of Poetry, episode 18. This will be the last episode devoted to poets who were influenced by Walt Whitman. Today's focus is the great poet Robert Frost. Harold Bloom, who died not too long ago, wrote a book in the 1970s called The Anxiety of Influence. His thesis was that poets need to rebel against the poets of the previous generation in order to clear a space for their own voice. One could make such an argument about Robert Frost and his literary antecedent, Walt Whitman. Robert Frost, who lived in the generation just after Whitman, with a slight overlap. Whitman died in 1892 when Frost was 18 years old. Frost must have felt the weight of Whitman's poetic presence as he himself began his career as a poet. Whitman was just too big to ignore. And yet, Frost, who ultimately took on the mantle of the great American poet from Whitman, was pretty much the diametric opposite of Whitman. Whitman's poems, as we know, tend to be long and sprawling. He wrote almost exclusively in free verse, and very rarely used rhyming words in his poems. Frost, on the other hand, tended to write shorter poems, and almost always employed traditional meter and rhyme. With Walt Whitman's poetry, it's all about Whitman. He himself is the central focus of many of his poems, with his most famous poem entitled Song of Myself. Frost is much more humble. His poems are characterized by a kind of folksy wisdom, and he never appears by name in his poems like Whitman does. Whitman is a loafer, loafing on the grass, enjoying the scenery. Frost is a worker. He would like to loaf and enjoy the scenery, but he has responsibilities to attend to. In one of Frost's most famous poems, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, the last lines of the poem are, "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." He would like to linger in the woods, but he has promises to keep and cannot abide the carefree, vagrant life of his literary antecedent, Walt Whitman. Even though Frost is known as a New England poet, he was actually born in San Francisco, where his father worked as a journalist. His father died when Robert was 11, and his mother subsequently took the family back to New England, where she was from. He married his high school sweetheart. She was actually co-valedictorian with Frost in high school. Frost did a stint at Harvard University and at Dartmouth, but he never graduated from either. He worked in various odd jobs and worked on and off as a farmer pretty much his whole life, but his most enduring occupation was as an English teacher, and later as a university instructor. He and his wife had 6 children, but most of them died in their youth. Only 2 actually survived Frost. So he did have his fair share of family sorrow. In 1912, the family moved to England, where cost of living was cheaper. They stayed there 3 years, and it was there that Frost completed and published his first book of poetry, which was a smashing success, and immediately established his reputation as a poet of great skill and ability. When the family came back to America in 1915, Frost was already being offered teaching positions at various universities. Frost went on to become the major American poet of the first half of the 20th century. He won 4 Pulitzer Prizes for his work. He was awarded a Congressional Gold Medal in 1960. We know how much a splash the young poet Amanda Gorman made at the Biden inauguration. But the first poet ever to recite a poem at a presidential inauguration was Robert Frost. He was invited by John F. Kennedy to recite a poem at the inauguration ceremony in 1961. So many of Frost's poems have become part of our cultural vocabulary. One only has to mention The Road Not Taken. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Almost everyone knows this poem. So even though this poem is probably the most misinterpreted poem of all time, Google it, we're not going to focus on it today, but instead look at a slightly less famous poem called Mending Wall, which was published in 1914 It was one of Frost's early poems, and one of the poems that established his reputation as a great poet. Mending Wall. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen groundswell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun, and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair where they have left not one stone on a stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps, I mean. No one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time, we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each. And some are loaves, and some so nearly balls, we have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to little more. There where it is, we do not need the wall. He is all pine, and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there bringing a stone, grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage armed. He moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods only in the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well. He says again, good fences make good neighbors. Mending Wall is about an annual spring ritual that the poet has with his neighbor. There's a wall made of stones that separates the speaker of the poem, let's call him our hero's property, from his neighbor's property. During the winter, the wall gets damaged by the elements, by the snow and wind, by animals, by hunters, as our hero explains. And each spring, our hero meets with his neighbor to walk the length of the wall, each on his side, and make repairs to the wall as they go along. As they go through this process, our hero questions what they're doing. Why do we even have to have a wall, he asks. Neither of us have cows or other pasturing animals. The trees can't jump the wall and go over to the other side. But the neighbor responds, good fences make good neighbors. Much has been written about this adage, good fences make good neighbors. Philosophically, the neighbor believes that people will get along better if they establish boundaries. And our hero wants to suggest that perhaps such boundaries are outdated and unnecessary. So our hero, he admits that he's mischievous, continues to badger his neighbor. But the neighbor will not be swayed. He just repeats what he believes to be true. Good fences make good neighbors. Our hero can't seem to convince him that maybe it's not true. Maybe you can still be good neighbors, maybe even better neighbors, without fences. The neighbor for our hero is like some kind of caveman, a Neanderthal, stuck in his ways, unable to evolve, unable to go beyond his pat, predictable point of view. In the end, the poem leaves us with more questions than answers. Is it better to have fences, to set boundaries, to have property markers? Does this keep us honest? Or might it be better to live with no fences, no boundaries, to actually trust one's neighbors? What I love about this poem is how Frost elevates a simple, mundane ritual into something meaningful and important. The dialogue in the poem is again simple, but we get a clear picture of the two characters in this poem. Our hero, who dares to question the existing norms, and the neighbor, who cannot think outside the box, living by a principle he has unquestioningly and perhaps unthinkingly accepted and inherited from his father. I love the language in the poem. Elves, he says at one point in the poem, which I always thought was a quaint expletive, although he could literally be suggesting that elves have done the damage to the wall. Whatever the case, it comes as an unexpected surprise in the poem. And there are so many inventive surprises in the language and descriptions in this poem. Finally, I mentioned earlier that many of Frost's poems rhyme. This one doesn't. But it does have a meter and a rhythm. Unlike Whitman's free verse, this is closer to Wordsworth's blank verse, which doesn't rhyme, but has a consistent meter, a beat that carries from line to line. Well, I hope you enjoyed our brief discussion of Robert Frost, and I hope this encourages you to read some of his other poems, which are quite accessible and quite enjoyable and available on the internet. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on The Lion of Poetry.
Blab, blab.